tutorial, I'm going to talk about 3 scales that we can use when we're improvising over dominant 7th chords, which have some altered notes in. Let's just talk about altered notes first of all. Let's take an ordinary G7 chord. We have the root, the 3rd, the 5th and the 7th. Now there are 4 altered notes that you can have on dominant 7th chords. Let's look at this one and we can give it 2 names. If we think of that as D flat, then we call it the flattened 5th. If we think of it as C sharp, it's called the sharpened 11th. 11th because the note C is 11 letter names above G. So they are exactly the same thing, just different names, and you will see both being used. The next one is this note. Now again, we can give it 2 names. We can call it the sharpened 5th, so call it D sharp, it's the sharpened 5th. We think of it as E flat, it's the flattened 13th. E is 13 letter names above G, E flat, flattened 13th. The next one is this note. A is the 9th, A flat is the flattened 9th, and A sharp is the sharpened 9th. So we've got 4 possible altered notes, those 2 and those 2. Now, there are 3 different scales that we can use that contain some of those altered notes. The first one is the diminished scale, and I've already talked about this in previous videos, but it's well worth going over again. It's a really useful scale. Once again, let's take the G7 chord and add a flattened 9th above it. Take the root G away, and we are left with this chord. This is a B diminished 7th chord. Now, we can connect each of the chord notes, B, D, F and A flat, by approaching each one of them from a note a semitone below. So that's a semitone below D, E is a semitone below F and so on. And we end up with this scale. And that is a diminished scale. Now, I just want to clarify a little bit of confusion that often arises when people are studying diminished scales, because in theory books you see this called a half-tone, whole-tone diminished scale or a whole-tone, half-tone diminished scale. And they are exactly the same thing. It just depends really where you're starting from. So if you start from B, the next note is a whole tone above it. Then a half tone, whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half note, whole tone, half note. If you started it on G, you go up a half tone, then a whole tone, half tone, whole tone. So the 2 scales mean exactly the same thing. It just depends where you're starting from. Okay, now it's really useful. It's another 8-note scale. It's like the Bebop scale. It's got 8 notes in it. And therefore, just like the Bebop scales, if you're playing an improvised line in 8th notes or 16th notes, and you play a chord note on a downbeat, you can go up and down this scale, change direction, do whatever you like, and you will always land on a chord note on a downbeat. Just want to clarify, when I say chord notes, remember, if we were thinking of a G7 with a flattened 9, we're really thinking of that, the B diminished 7th being the chord, and therefore the chord notes are B, D, F and A flat, not the G. Okay, so you can come up with all kinds of little patterns with this. In the introduction, one of the lines I played was this. I'll do it slowly this time. You can make little exercises out of that, go up 2 octaves. You can come up with all kinds of little patterns on diminished scales, and they are really, really useful. So let's just think about the diminished scale in relation to the altered notes that I was talking about. Let's start the scale on G this time. Okay, so we've got the A flat and the A sharp. We've got those two notes. We've got the C sharp. We haven't got the E flat or D sharp. So he's got 3 of the altered tones in. Okay, now let's look at the whole tone scale. Now, whole tone scale is quite simply, you start on any note and you play a tone and then another tone and so on. So if we start on G, whole tone, whole tone, whole tone, whole tone, whole tone, whole tone. It's got a very distinctive sound. I always think it sounds like something that they use in children's programs when they're talking about a spaceship flying off into space and they do something like this. It's used when you're playing a G7 with either notated as a sharpened 5th or a flattened 13th. So remember, G7, that's the 5th. Sharpen the 5th, it's the same as the flattened 13th. And a really useful left-hand voicing while you're playing that is that one. The 7th, the 3rd, and then the sharpened 5th or flattened 13th up at the top like that. And one of the examples that I played at the beginning was this little idea. And then going when you resolve to the tonic. Okay, so the third scale that I'm talking about today is called the altered scale. Now, an altered scale contains all the altered notes of a dominant 7th chord. We start the altered scale on G, goes like this. It's got all 4 of the altered notes in it. Now, this scale actually exists in another life. It's the 7th mode of an ascending melodic minor scale. That sounds really complicated, but try and keep it simple in your mind. Think of an A-flat melodic minor scale ascending. Not descending, which is different, where the sharpened 6th and 7th are then lowered a semitone coming down. We're just talking about the ascending melodic minor scale. And if we start it on the 7th note of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, G, I'll bring the G down here, start it there. So it uses all the notes of the A-flat melodic minor scale ascending. And again, it's a useful scale because it contains every one of the possible altered notes in a dominant 7th chord. So sometimes you'll see chords notated just as G altered, and that just means it's got some of the altered notes in it. So one of the lines I played at the beginning was... And again, that one used all the notes. There's the flattened 13th, flattened 5th, flattened 9th, sharpened 9th. So that one contains all of them. In terms of sort of which scales you use the most, I would say that the diminished scale is probably, just about the most useful of those 3 scales. The altered scale is certainly used quite a bit. The whole tone scale is not used, quite as much as those 2, but it's another one that you really need to use. You don't very often actually play lines where you're using all the altered notes. You tend to stick to bits of the altered scale, and I would say that the 2 most used altered notes are the flattened 9th and the sharpened 9th. So you get licks like this, playing a 2-5-1. So it's all just diatonic notes, apart from that chromatic passing note in the bebop scale, until you get to there, and that kind of thing's ever so common. Another one would be. So again, you're going up to those two altered notes, and then using that little jazz cliche that I've talked about before, taking you to the third of C major 6. Right at the beginning, I played an arpeggio. I can just do 1 octave. That's a really useful, well-used little arpeggio. Don't overdo it because it does get used a lot, but it really gives you some tension, some colour in it. It's got the sharp 9th going to the flattened 9th, and then it's got the flattened 13th or sharpened 5th. You can actually think of that as being an upper structure triad. That's something I've covered in other videos, not in this particular course. It's an upper structure triad and minor triad formed on the flattened 9th. And then it just has 1 extra note. So lots of ideas there. Experiment with that. Have fun, and we will see you in the next video. If you've enjoyed this and found it useful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you.